do you serve? Or is it an experience that you may have from years ago? What do you think of the Prime Minister's pledge to massively boost defense spending? Our number across BC is 1-800-825-5950. Here in Metro Vancouver, the number is 604-669-3733. You can also hit pound 690. Again, please be pulled over or hands-free if you're driving. And you can email us, bctoday@cbc.ca, and leave a comment on our TikTok stream at CBC British Columbia. November 11th marked the end of the First World War in 1918 on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month. More than a century later, Canadians gather every year on this day to commemorate those who served this country, gave their lives to defend it, and those who continue to serve. The largest gathering in BC took place a short time ago in Vancouver's Victory Square. You can hear a ceremonial flyover and the pipes just after 11 o'clock today as the servicemen played and marched around the monument as thousands looked on quietly. The ceremony reflected on veterans' history of sacrifice in the many wars Canada has fought in. That drumming came from the Japanese-Canadian War Memorial in Stanley Park. This year holds a particular significance, marking the 80th anniversary of the Second World War and the 75th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. Remembering the stories of veterans and preserving Canadian military history is critical to understanding the sacrifices, courage, and resilience that have shaped this country. We're asking you, who do you want to commemorate this Remembrance Day? Is it an event? Is it a person? What does Remembrance Day mean to you? Call us now. As we said, pound 690 on your cell phone. You can get us at across the province, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733 in Metro Vancouver. You can email us, bctoday@cbc.ca. Some of you have already started doing that. We appreciate it. Keep it coming. And you can leave a comment on our TikTok Live. Joining us for this program is David Zimmerman. He's a professor of military history at the University of Victoria and also runs the Veterans Oral History Project on Vancouver Island. David, thank you for joining us. First of all, what's going through your mind on this Remembrance Day?
Always on this day, I reflect back at the tremendous sacrifices made by so many so that we could enjoy the freedoms that we have today. One of the things that always strikes me, and I've had opportunities to visit many of Canada's military cemeteries overseas, at Vimy and in Normandy, is the youth of most of those that gave their lives in conflicts. You go down through the cemeteries, you'll see they're 18, 19, 20, the same age as many of my students. And it's why it's so important to remember the sacrifices so that we preserve what we have, and also so hopefully we never have to engage in such conflict again.
For anybody who has gone to one of those cemeteries, and I was fortunate enough to do so a number of years ago, just outside of Normandy, it is absolutely striking how well kept they are and how the students, as you mentioned, younger people, take the time to make sure that those graves are immaculate for people who, when they died, were not much older than those who were doing that tending. It is beyond striking, isn't it?
It really is. And the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which is responsible for all British Commonwealth war graves overseas, does an incredible job at preserving those cemeteries and a reminder of what those people gave in conflicts. And we'll find these war graves throughout everywhere Canada fought. Many of them are never visited. For instance, there may be some in Burma. There's some, I know there's one in Hong Kong, which I actually have visited. And very often those people get forgotten, but still they all gave their lives fighting for this country. And I think it's always important to remember what they've done. And that, I think, is the principal purpose of this day. We get diverted to a lot of other things, but the principal one is to remember the sacrifice for those that served.
Very good point. I think we have a call ready to go. Dave is joining us from Mackenzie. Dave, I see this is an intensely personal day for you and your family. Would you be able to share that?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not something that really weighed a lot on my conscience or my consciousness actually throughout my life. But now I'm 60 years old, and my family is kind of in disarray. Like my blood family, we don't really talk that much. And there my uncle Charlie Baldry lays in a grave in Sicily because he was defending us from what is going on today in the United States of America. And I'd just like to stop there. Thank you.
Dave, I appreciate the call. You mentioned in the note just before you came on the air, he had 3 uncles who served in World War II, David, and one, as we heard, Charlie Baldry, who never came back. Buried in Sicily. He says his sacrifice is so significant as we see the current political air in humanity right now. Without diving into the present day, David, it's certainly, when we look back on this day, it's hard not to see a full breadth of history. And I'm not making any direct comparisons, but we certainly have a sense of things, of pivot points, perhaps. Is that fair to say? My apologies. I think we're having a little trouble with David and his audio. David, my apologies. If hopefully you can hear us again.
Sorry, you were breaking up, and I wasn't sure which David you were talking.
My apologies, David. Interesting. Without going into a full recap of present day events, certainly this date brings back a lot of memories and sometimes painful memories throughout history for people, and clearly that was one for our caller.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to the caller that his uncle may be buried in Sicily, but he's not forgotten. And there are regular Canadian visitors to the Canadian cemeteries in Sicily and throughout Italy. I know that there are often student groups that go there that pay tribute to those people. And I think one of the really important things that is done at the few universities that teach military history is that we make connections with those that served in the past and those that are still with us who are serving today or are veterans of more recent events. And it's really important for the young people to understand what other young people did for them.
Let's go to Mick in Victoria. Mick, your grandfathers served. What would you like to share about them?
Well, they were, like the last caller just said, they were young men that went to serve their country and their following of freedom. And I guess the main thing I want to say is that young people still are being sent without a deep knowledge of why to fight the wars of rich people and politicians. And what's going on in Palestine right now and in the United States makes it a huge shame that the sacrifices that all these guys made, all these people made, seem to have been a waste today.
All right, Mick, we appreciate the call. David, we are marking the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, the 75th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. If you can, a little history lesson. What can you share with us about the significance of Canadian forces in both of those conflicts? And conflicts doesn't seem to do it justice.
No, I think they were both full-blown wars. And, the reality is that we are still living throughout much of the world with the great sacrifices of those that fought and some, in many cases, died in the Second World War, because we still see much of the world with free democratic societies. Much of Europe is exactly that. And there, of course, I think the greatest threat to what was won in the Second World War is occurring in Ukraine and with what the Russians are doing in the Ukraine. And there are other, of course, risks as well. But still, I think what they did was still with us. The legacy is still very, very much with us today. And as for Korea, Korea is a bit more complex because it was really the first great battle but of the Cold War, even though it was very much a hot war. But certainly for the people of South Korea, it meant that they don't live in the despotic regime of the North and that they are part of a modern Western society and are very much contributors to that, not just in terms of their industry, but also in terms of their culture. And none of that would have been possible without what the Canadians did. The Canadians played an important, but albeit small, role in the Korean War, as they did in the Second World War.
In the Second World War, if I remember right, give us a sense of the numbers, if you can, the sheer numbers. Certainly, if memory serves, more Canadian soldiers were killed in the First World War, but it was not insignificant for the Second.
No, I mean, part of the policies of the Mackenzie King government in the Second World War was to avoid the sort of casualties that had occurred in the First World War. 60,000 died in the First World War, about 45,000 died in the Second World War. It's still a huge number, a vast number of people that paid the ultimate sacrifice. But Canada had a much more diverse role in the Second World War, where almost all of our military was committed to the front lines in France and the trenches in the First World War. Canadians served in the air, on the sea, as well as on the ground. And of course, Canada made an immense industrial contribution in the Second World War, much larger than our industrial contribution in the First World War. So even though we are a larger country by population, the total casualties were lower, but this was part of a clear policy by the government, but also for the fact, if you consider where most casualties occur, where in ground combat, Canadians were really only in intense ground combat for the last 2 years of the war.
And would that be Italy, Europe?
Yeah, beginning with the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, Italy, onto France, and then, of course, through into the Low Countries, the liberation of the Netherlands, and then the battles on into Germany, where Canadians were fighting and dying right until the last day of the war in April 1945.
You
The
specialize.
Canadians also made huge sacrifices in the air. They made up of about a third of the aircrew of Bomber Command, which suffered massive casualties during the conflict.
I understand you specialize in the history of the Royal Canadian Navy in the Second World War. Can you give us a sense of the Navy's role in the war in that time when our maritime power was certainly numerically much larger?
Well, we started off the war with a very tiny navy of about 11 warships. And by the end of the conflict, there were about 450 warships in commission. Now, they were mostly very small. There were a few cruisers, but mostly they were frigates, corvettes, some destroyers. And their primary role was in escorting merchant ships across the Atlantic. And in this, Canada played a vital role. And in fact, by the end of 1943, they took over the running of most of the North Atlantic convoy routes, which was incredibly important for the war effort. D-Day doesn't happen. The invasion of North Africa doesn't happen, or Sicily or Italy does not happen without the merchant marine carrying the supplies and the people necessary to fight those battles. So the Canadian Navy played a decisive role, and it did suffer some horrendous losses during the conflict.
We're speaking about Remembrance Day. If there's somebody that you are remembering, if you are a military member, if you are still serving, if there's someone you'd like to share their service with us, give us a call, 1-800-825-5950. Our number in Metro Vancouver is 604-669-3733. You can email us, bctoday@cbc.ca. I'm going to read a few of those in just a moment. You can leave a comment on our TikTok page. We're speaking with David Zimmerman, professor of military history at UVic, and he also runs the Veterans Oral History Project on Vancouver Island. Rudy wrote us to say, I was at Mountain View Cemetery this morning for the annual observance with music, brass instruments, and voices. I'm always conflicted because I was born in Germany. My father and uncle served in the German army in World War II. I do believe that earlier generations were better at honoring and reintegrating soldiers into peacetime society. Warfare was deemed necessary, but it was also understood that it was necessary to help soldiers lay down not only their arms, but also their mindset, their behavior, to help them be ordinary citizens again. I grieve for those in our time who were not killed in action, but often lived diminished and troubled lives after serving in battles. David Zimmerman, a sentiment that we have heard before, that on both sides of conflicts, where we have horror and love for people who served.
Yeah, I mean, it is conflicting, but one of the great achievements of the Second World War was that we can call Germany our friends, and that they are part of the Western Alliance. They are a very strong democratic state, and so is Japan. So there certainly was very positive outcomes from the war. But to address the letter writer's comments as well, the fact of the matter is people always came back, those that survived very often did come back damaged. And one of the struggles after the First World War was particularly to recognize that it wasn't just physical damage, it was also psychological damage. And Canada actually did pretty well by the standards of the time in trying to address those issues. But still, I don't think people fully realized at the end of the First World War, at the end of the Second World War, Korea, just how disruptive to a person was the experience of experiencing the horrors of war. And now we're really confronting the fact that soldiers do suffer, they do come back damaged. They need help to adjust. They have things that they often have difficulty managing on their own, and that there's been somewhat of a systemic failure in the system to help these people make that transition back to civilian society. And this is certainly one of the great ongoing struggles, which I know the Armed Forces and Veterans Affairs continues to try to figure out the exact correct way to deal with these issues.
We're speaking about Remembrance Day. Is there someone you want to commemorate on this day? Are you a serving member? What has your experience been? Call us now, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. In Metro Vancouver, you can email us, bctoday@cbc.ca, or leave us a comment on our TikTok page. And I do want to read one more email. In that vein, David Zimmerman, Ruth, who says to us, my father was a war hero who had PTSD, but managed to raise us and have a good life in and around Vancouver. Only now that I'm old do I realize how he must have suffered. After the war, he joined the Vancouver Police, and Constable Renwick was a popular and nice person by all accounts and belonged to the pipe band, learned the chatter during his incarceration as a prisoner of war, helped him put his energies into something positive. He was shot at Dieppe, recovered, and went to find the nuns after he retired, but he couldn't. It sounds like they were able to help him. He wanted to thank them. Rest in peace, Dad. That vein of helping those who have been traumatized, damaged, and in some cases shattered. David Zimmerman, how do you think we're doing today?
I think we're doing better by simply recognizing how widespread the issues can be. There's far too often it's been swept under the table, particularly in a form of masculinity that we should just grim and bear it. And I think the reality is that we send people into conflicts. Those conflicts cause trauma. And the trauma can be just psychological. I say just psychological. That can be crippled as much as any physical. And we're trying to do better, but I think there's still a lot more that can be done.
Let's go to Lex in Nanaimo. Lex, thanks for calling. You have a family connection to the First World War.
Yeah, well, actually, I had two uncles who fought in World War One. One was wounded at Vimy Ridge, but the other one, the one I'm speaking, he was my grandmother's brother. His name was Alec O'Brien, and he was severely injured at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. He had a terrible head wound, and he had to learn how to read and write, walk, almost walk. He had to learn how to walk again, and this. And he went in for a very long recuperation, and he was repatriated to a small town in Nova Scotia. And when he was back, by the time he got back, it would have been probably late 1917, early 1918 by the time he was recuperated enough to go back. He was asked shortly after his return if he would come and speak at a recruitment rally, because at that point, 1918, it was getting really hard for people to get volunteers to go to France, as you can imagine. So he said yes. Now, this is not to denigrate anybody who sacrificed for their brothers, but what he said, we were sacrificing for each other. So he was asked to go to this rally, and he said, "You're all being told here today that this is a war in the glory to fight for king and country and the honor of empire." He said, "They're lying. There is no honor here. This is a bloodbath. If you survive the gunfight, you will die. You will die of infection, vermin, rats, everything." He said, "Don't go. You are just supporting global imperial interests that has nothing to do with freedom or safety." And I think it's important to remember, especially with World War I, because I've heard it today. Oh, we were fighting for freedom. We weren't fighting for freedom in World War I. It was a family squabble around the crown heads, and we need to stop glorifying things that don't need to be glorified. In World War II, you can have all kinds of discussions about the need for and things like that, but World War I was the last of the great European wars, which was nothing more than an attempted war of land grabbing. And we need to stop glorifying war aggression, which is just imperial land grabbing. And we need to stop justifying it.
Lex, I really appreciate your call. Just before we get to the news, David Zimmerman, interesting that his uncle said, "Don't go," especially at a pretty pivotal time.
Well, all I can say is, the First World War, certainly it's not a clear-cut conflict, good versus evil. But I will say that's not what Remembrance Day is about. Remembrance Day is about the sacrifices of those that served. It has nothing to do with whether the war was good or bad. It has to do with those individuals, and that's what we have to remember. Those who want to bring in these broader questions, I think this is the wrong place for them. It really is a day for the veterans and the day for the families of those that did not return.
This is BC Today on CBC. We're on Radio 1 and live streaming on our website, cbc.ca/BC, YouTube, and at CBC Vancouver, and on the CBC News app. Coming up, we're going to take more of your calls and emails on this Remembrance Day. So if you are on the line, Christine, Howard, Gabriel, please stay on the line. We will get to you. Who or what are you remembering? And we will speak with Canada's former Minister of Defence as he takes on a new role working to help BC secure more funding for national defence dollars. Harjit Sajjan will be our guest along with David Zimmerman. That's after this news update with Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. As we've been hearing on the show, thousands of people turned up at Victory Square here in Vancouver and at other ceremonies across BC and the rest of the country to honor those who fought for this country. Remembrance Day ceremonies across BC fell silent for 2 minutes to honor their sacrifice. There were flyovers from Royal Canadian Air Force aircraft in the interior, on Vancouver Island, and at the service at Victory Square. Police say a woman from Vancouver has been found dead at the resort she owned in Belize. Marty Thorne's body was discovered yesterday morning. Police say she had been stabbed 8 times. One suspect is in custody, but officers are looking for 2 more. And a BC man who worked for a New Westminster substance use recovery centre has been sentenced to 3 years in prison for sexual assault. Adam Haber was charged 2 years ago for offences that took place a decade earlier. Haber was an independent contractor with an organization offering substance use recovery services to women. And now the forecast on the north coast, a mix of sun and cloud this afternoon with a high of 7. Highs up to 7 with sunshine in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, sunny with a high of 6. Highs up to 9 with a mix of sun and cloud in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, some sun and cloud with a high of 10. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, mainly sunny this afternoon with highs around 12. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
Zimmerman, Robert Zimmerman, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us on this Remembrance Day as we take more of your calls and emails. Perhaps there's somebody that you are remembering today that you would like to share. Certainly, we've heard a lot of perspectives. David Zimmerman, an historian at the University of Victoria, is joining us now. In just a few moments, we will bring in another guest of ours, Harjit Sajjan, former Minister of Defense and veteran as well. Let's go back to, I believe, some of our calls, if we have one. Gabriel is in Victoria. Gabriel, thanks for waiting on the line. What are you thinking about on this day?
Well, I mean, this day, the slogan has been "Lest we forget," but it's hard to know what it is we're supposed to remember when we've never had any democratic political discussion about Canada's geopolitical orientation. We're told to throw our lot in with America's claim that they know best for the entire world, and anyone who disagrees is a mortal enemy. I want to talk about the war budget, which is one of the topics. And I'll just set aside for now the question of who's the greatest threat to Canada at this point, whether it's the Russians invading us via the North Pole or the Chinese coming across the largest ocean in the world, or the largest military empire in history sitting right next door to us, whose president repeatedly taunts us about annexation. But let's talk about the war budget. I think when you're talking about budgets, the question of who decides, who pays, who benefits is always relevant. Obviously, the Prime Minister and his ruling party have decided that we're going to have the largest military expenditures in the country's history. And I just wanted to give some numbers in terms of what it would actually mean to the working class taxpayer of what we would actually be paying for, and compare that to other expenditures that the federal government has. So the example I'll give is that we've been told that there's a 2% cap on fiscal transfers to provinces and territories going forward. This would be for healthcare and other programs. So I did some calculations.
Gabriel, I'm going to just jump, if I can, if we can, I'm going to give you another 20 seconds just to narrow in on what you'd really like to, the nut of your argument, please.
Appreciate it. What I'm saying is that if you look at the budget document, they're going to add $30 billion to an already $40 billion war budget. That's $70 billion in the next 5 years. But if you take the calculation for healthcare, that's currently around $54 billion, that will be $60 billion in 5 years from now. In other words, we'll be spending around $10 billion more on the war budget than the federal government transfers to provinces for healthcare. And by year 10, they're saying $150 billion for the war budget. That'll dwarf healthcare, which will be around $67 billion, and it'll actually be more than the total federal transfers to provinces and territories, which would be around $126.5 billion. So the question is, what do people want to pay for? What we're paying for is going to benefit American war manufacturers, and everything else is going to be put at the bottom.
Gabriel, I'm going to jump in. I appreciate your call, and I'm going to put that question once we introduce Harjit Sajjan to that. I do know that, and we've been covering this extensively with our colleagues in Europe as well as in South Korea, where Canada is looking beyond the United States, for example, for submarines, with 2 bids coming in from South Korean firms and from, I believe, a German-Norwegian conglomerate. Let's go to another call now. Gabriel, Gabriel, thanks again for your call. Christine, you've been waiting in Williams Lake. Christine, thanks for calling. Who are you thinking of on this day?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I'm on the edge of the highway.
Not a problem.
Great.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
My dad, we always celebrated this day more than, it was bigger than Christmas in our household. From Prince Rupert all the way to Nelson in the Kootenays. My dad was the first Canadian wounded in the Second World War, and he was so frustrated that Canada was not doing anything. It reminded me of that news thing this morning where the American joined up with the Canadians. And my dad went over, paid his own way to Scotland, and joined up with his dad's regiment, the Scottish Highlanders. And then he was in Dunkirk and shot up. And then he was on a hospital ship, and the Germans dropped a bomb down the funnel of the hospital ship, and then he was blown out into the water. And you know that poem, The Little Boats of Britain, that picked everybody up out of the water? Well, my dad was one of those. Then he had to get back to Canada, but he was in such rough shape. He shook continuously, like trembled. They did in Edinburgh, the Faculty of Medicine was experimenting with the shock treatments. So he got shock treatments, and yet when they still all pooled together, his relatives, to ship him back to Canada, they would have these welcoming teas in Battleford, North Battleford. And my dad couldn't hold the teacups. So even though we have pictures of him with these teas that were honoring him, and he was the only war veteran back at that point, it was just really interesting listening to him. And he really made sure that we grew up honoring the veterans. So I'm just so thrilled. It just makes me cry that you're doing this show, and not just what the fellow said about the ones that gave their lives, because my dad gave a lot in terms of what would be like a broken spirit, and he was still really feisty Canadian, playing the bagpipes all the time on this particular day. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you for sharing your dad's story with us. Let's go to Howard on Denman Island. Howard, thanks for waiting. What are you thinking of on this Remembrance Day?
Thank you for taking my call. I'm not sure if anyone's mentioned it already, but what I think about as much as anything is the sacrifices of all the women. I spent lots of time growing up. I'm getting old. I spent lots of time growing up with both my grandmothers here on the coast. Both of their lives have been devastated by losing husbands, fathers, sons. One grandmother lost her father of her 4 young children, and then the next war lost the youngest son from that. And the other grandmother lost various people, but especially her brother, who she was very attached to. And I was very conscious of it because I spent so much time with them. And I think I mention it partly because, you can multiply it by many thousands of times. All the women made huge contributions to the war efforts, but they also made huge sacrifices that people don't talk about that much.
Holding up the home front, right?
Yeah, holding up the home front and suffering enormously from loss of loved ones, especially the First World War, but the second too. That we kind of, because we focus on the sacrifices made by the men, we kind of forget what the women had to do. I wanted to mention one other thing that somebody mentioned on the way by, and that is, the ongoing, I don't know how to say it, complicity or negligence of the situation in Palestine itself, a direct result of mega crimes in the Second World War for which Palestinians had no responsibility whatsoever. I think that it dishonors all of our war efforts to go on putting up with this embattled, ever more suffering Bantustan that's been created in what used to be Palestine. I think it is really kind of a smear on all of our earlier accomplishments.
Howard, appreciate your call. Thank you very much. And a very good reminder for the breadth of sacrifice that has been made. If you're just joining us, we're listening to BC Today and watching it. We're with David Zimmerman. He's an historian with the University of Victoria. I want to bring in our next guest now. This Remembrance Day does come on the heels of the federal government making significant investments in Canada's national defence in what Mark Carney's Liberals describe as a blueprint to defend Canadian sovereignty. The federal government earmarked more than $81 billion over 5 years toward defence spending, aiming to boost domestic industries through procurement and creating jobs, and also pledging to boost our NATO contribution to 5% of GDP in the next decade. Now, the BC government has enlisted former MP Harjit Sajjan to help our province secure some military dollars. Sajjan served as Canada's Minister of Defence from 2015 to 2021 and also served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He joins us now in studio. Harjit, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for your service. What is going through your mind on this day?
First of all, just listening to all the callers, it just reminds me of the sacrifice that has been made. It goes far beyond than the people who have served. But for me personally, I always look at every single year as a kind of important reminder and what new things have I learned. And one of the things this year for me is special is about there's been a lot of sacrifice made by groups who didn't get the recognition that they deserved. I'm thinking about Task Force 136 from the Chinese community, who served, Private Bukam Singh and many others from the Sikh community. And the list goes on. And just reminds us that the sacrifice was far broad, as one of your callers had mentioned. And obviously, think about a lot of the friends who I served with who didn't make it home as well, and my heart goes out to their families.
I see you were wearing medals from various campaigns that you've
just came from the ceremony.
Yeah,
yes.
And where was the ceremony? You were at Victory Square?
No, actually at Memorial Park. My son is a cadet, and he was parading there, so I finally get to go to his ceremony as well.
When you see him parading and taking part in cadets, what's going through your mind as we hear about what you did and sacrificed, and what future generations may be asked to do?
What goes through my mind is that I find it sad that we still have to put the uniform on and regrettably look at having a stronger defense. That there is a chance that my son, or if my daughter ever chooses to join the military one day, that they too will have to serve and sacrifice for their country. But it reminds us that we as parents, and we need to work harder, making sure that we live up to those sacrifices so that our children don't have to go through the same hardship that previous generations have. And we'll keep working hard to do that.
We're going to get to more calls in just a moment. I do want to ask you, Harjit, about this new job you've taken. I understand you're doing this for free, is that right?
Yeah.
So what will be your role for the BC? Are you going to be lobbying Ottawa directly, or how's this going to work?
Well, first of all, I cannot lobby. That's one of the rules.
Yes,
I want to make that very, very clear.
Okay,
I can advise the BC government.
Yeah.
No, when the minister called me up and said...
this is Robbie Callon.
That's right.
Jobs Minister.
Yeah, that's right. And he wants to look at how BC can help with what Canada is trying to do with Prime Minister Carney's government. And of course I was going to help. And as a former BC minister and a former minister of defense, I have a pretty good idea of what the needs are. And I told him that BC is very unique. And so what my role is to advise him and his team to look at how not only what BC can benefit, it's more importantly what BC can contribute. And through that contribution comes I think tremendous opportunities. We have many different industries that provide some amazing products for the Canadian Armed Forces when it comes to our shipbuilding, Seaspan and many other companies. There's a company in Burnaby that makes our bridges. When I was in the Atlantic provinces at the Irving, visiting our first Arctic patrol ship that was being built, the company from Burnaby is actually building all the bridges, and the list goes on. But the thing is to meet the needs of where we need to go in our defense spending. I'm very thankful for Prime Minister Carney's leadership, which was started by Prime Minister Trudeau initially, that all provinces are going to have to step up. But BC has an amazing talent to offer up to making sure that, at the same time, make the contributions, But at the same time, looking at defense, not from a spending perspective, but an investment of how to create good quality jobs.
Where do you see you talked about what BC can offer, shipbuilding, bridges that are designed by a company in Burnaby. Are there things in BC right now that we do need? Is it expanded military bases? Is it expanded shipbuilding capacity for, I mean, we're looking to buy a whole bunch of submarines. So what is it that you think BC, based on your experience, BC needs?
Well, first of all, I think there's going to be some more industry that's going to be needed. So when you look at the number of ships that are going to be built, but let's not forget from building the ships, there are all the maintenance that's going to be required. So you're looking at decades into the future. For first and foremost, is good skilled workers. That is absolutely crucial, and I know that the Minister Collin is seized with that. But then let's not forget, when it comes to our steel industry, the parts that need to be created, the foundries that potentially might be needed. When we look at the number of ships and the submarines, I can tell you, building the ports is going to be extremely important. And the list goes on. And there's so many other secondary industries. When we look at building ships, we always look at the actual product itself, whether it's the ship. But it's actually the integration of the systems that are inside that's actually needed, and something that we are actually very good in Canada. Not just for us, I would say that some of our software is being used all over the world, especially in the U.S. and within our Five Eyes community.
Let's go back to our calls now. We're joined by David Zimmerman, an historian with the University of Victoria, as well as Harjit Sajjan, former Minister of Defense and who served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. Peter has been waiting in Surrey. Peter, what's your connection to this day?
Well, I'm thinking of a lot of different people this day, including my parents and my wife's parents. Both my wife and I are first-generation Canadian. My parents came from Britain, and my wife's parents came from Holland, and were liberated by the Canadian and British forces. On my side, my father was conscripted into the British Armed Forces, and then along came a gentleman by the name of Lord Bevan, and he created the Bevan Boys. And the Bevan Boys were conscripted into the coal mines in Britain. They weren't frontline fighters, but it was equally dangerous. My father was involved in a cave-in in these coal mines, and you can't think of coal mines as we know them today. These were completely different back then. And my father had to pull a blasting cap out of a detonation charge while the cave-in had occurred in order to save his comrades and himself. My mother was a member of WAC, and she was on a glider base in Britain, and she witnessed, people going off on a one-way journey as a glider pilot. And my wife's family were liberated, as mentioned, by the Canadians and the British Armed Forces. And as my wife said today at a ceremony to one of the people that were joining us, that you don't really appreciate freedom until you're occupied.
Peter, thank you so much. Yes, for many Canadians of all stripes, the liberation lives deeply in their hearts, and for my family as well. Chris is in White Rock. Chris, what is your connection, or what's going through your mind today?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I suppose I wanted to express how complicated a relationship I have with Remembrance Day. I attend every year. And in my family, I'm the only one actually who was born in Canada. So like the previous call, I'm a first-generation Canadian. And I think about my father, who was in the British military. He served after the Second World War and was not an active service member in terms of combat. But I also think very, very much about my grandfather on my mother's side. And unfortunately, he was on the wrong side of the war. He was a German soldier, conscripted. And so, as I say, I have a kind of a complicated relationship with this very, very important day, which I think is so valuable. And yet I am always a little upset by some of the nationalist rhetoric, which I understand. I completely understand. And yet for me, it, as I said, complicates the relationship I have with I suppose, the risk of glorification of war in the name of nationalism, which has been such a poisonous force in history. So I think about the sacrifices very much, even though, as I say, the narrative at Remembrance Day is sometimes quite nationalistic. Although I have to say that over the very many years that I've attended the ceremony, more recently, I do feel that there's a bit more of a broader approach, an anti-war approach, which I very much appreciate because, as I say, my grandfather, who I was very fortunate to come to know, and he became a Canadian, actually. For him, that experience in the Second World War was a terrible one. But it was, of course, a time of service for him to a nation, and because of nationalistic reasons, in part, I suppose. So, as I said, a complicated relationship that I'm sure I share with many, many Canadians, being an immigrant country.
David, Chris, Chris, very much. Apologies for the interruption. Thank you very much. I want to go quickly to David Zimmerman. Interesting. Second time we've heard from somebody talking about mixed feelings, mixed legacy, simply by the background of their family.
No, and I understand that. And I've gone to Verdun, the great French battlefield site, which was over 250,000 people buried there. And right in the front of the main memorial building, there's a plaque. And the plaque is dedicated to the enduring friendship between Germany and France. And that one of the legacies that they wished to see out of the First World War was that the Europe would never again be divided along those nationalistic, imperialistic ways, and that Europe is united in a democratic system. And certainly this is what Canadian service people were fighting for. So, we don't have to be nationalistic on Remembrance Day. As I keep on emphasizing, it's about the individual person that served, whether they were in the military or whether they were in factories or whether they were homemakers at home, not knowing what was going to happen to their loved ones. All of these people made a significant contribution to preserving a world which would allow France and Germany to come together at a battlefield which saw more than 500,000 of their soldiers die, fighting each other.
We're going to get to another call in just a moment. Reg in Moberly Lake, stay with us. I do want to share one story. The first email we received from today was from Kathy Morse, who wanted to honor her dad, who fought in one of the most pivotal battles in history. And for those of you watching, we have some photos that she sent us. She says her dad, Hugh Morse, was born and raised in Haney, now Maple Ridge. He flew a Spitfire Mark 9 and was part of the D-Day operation over France. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross and was a proud veteran to the day he died in January 2008. She says he is our family's hero. Thank you for highlighting the service and sacrifices of brave Canadians. And Kathy, thank you for sharing that. For those of you watching, her dad, Hugh Morse, is second from the right, sitting on that wing of that Spitfire with a whole bunch of his very brave colleagues. Let's go to Reg now in Moberly Lake. Reg, what's going through your mind today?
Well, I share, a lot of the views that have been expressed, about the conflict of, thought and consciousness about the previous battles. My family has history going back to the earliest conflicts, and that was, the War of Independence and ancestor, a long-time great-grandfather, great-great, back to late 1700s. And John Montgomery ended up fighting in 1812 as well. And when I think, and later on in the 1837 rebellion in Upper Canada rebellion, and exiled, in fact, for his part in that. I think my message today is that we've got to make sure we keep teaching about all of what it means to have served. In those days, it was very much about loyalty to the crown. And when I think of how that carried forward right up to my great-grandfather, I still have in my possession the last medal that Queen Victoria gave out for long-standing service in the colonial forces. Mm-hmm. That's almost a dirty word, to talk about colonial forces. I've worked most of my career in Indigenous rights and the treaties. And we can't forget that the original treaties were peace treaties. And it's about coexistence. It's not about rights. You know, rights have been interpreted through the courts and everything, but my feeling is it's about our responsibilities. You know, I think of the ancestors that gave so much to carry those values forward, and I do believe it's strong. And our role in peacekeeping, I think, is formidable, in that we can hopefully potentially return to that. I'd be interested in what your guests have to say about return of peacekeeping forces.
We're going to try and get to that, Reg. My apologies. We're running up against the clock. I do want to get Fiona in Nanaimo. Fiona, forgive me. You're the last one. If you're able to keep it as brief as you can.
Yes, I'll keep it very brief. My mother's father was a steamship captain, and he was one of the merchant marines, fellows taking the convoys across. He has a lot of history. I've got buckets and buckets of things, including his hat and everything. And after the war, he was commissioned by the Crown to build a school to train sailors, the merchant marine sailors. I have the original curriculum.
Amazing. Fiona?
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
They came with no skills. So there needed to be a standard, and it was established in Canada in Hubbard's, Nova Scotia.
By your grandfather. Fiona,
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your call. Thank you for all the calls. And I want to thank our guests. I'm sorry we don't have any more time to chat. David Zimmerman with the University of Victoria historian, and Harjit Sajjan, former MP and Afghanistan veteran. You can listen to the show again on the CBC Listen app and watch us on demand on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. We very much appreciate all the emails and messages. If we weren't able to get to them, I will read them, and we will be able to share some of them tomorrow. I'm Dan Burwood, in for Michelle Elliott. Thank you for joining us on this Remembrance Day version of BC Today. Michelle will be back tomorrow.